The experts say this story is too good to be true. They promise us that we understand ancient Egypt and its history. They say there's no evidence for the biblical Exodus, that it's just an old story. But you can't bury the truth forever, no matter how much sand you have in the desert.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evidence for the Exodus. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a biblical scholar, an author, a musician, and a bit of an Egyptologist. And today I'm going to be walking you through the evidence that exists for the biblical Exodus. The very short story is that after some groundbreaking scholarship done over the last 5 years or so, we are now able to pinpoint when the Exodus happened, how it happened, who the pharaohs were of the Exodus, and we also have a bunch of archaeological evidence to support the biblical narrative of the Exodus. So I think this is really exciting because if we can demonstrate that the Exodus is an actual historical event, this would mean that the Torah is true, okay? Or at least it very strongly implies that the 5 books of Moses are accurate when they talk about the events that they describe. So in order to dig through the sands of time and understand how this all happened, we're going to have to go in depth into some aspects of Egyptology. We're going to have to dive into some of the archaeological evidence. And as I'll show you, we're going to have to rethink our understanding of ancient Egypt. So in this video, we're going to be looking at what the Exodus is. We're going to be looking at mainstream Egyptology and how that field has been developed over the last 150 years. We're going to be looking at archaeological clues that do exist for the Exodus. We're going to be revisiting the dynastic chronology that Egyptologists have constructed. And we are then going to put all the pieces together to show how and when the Exodus happened. So some of my sources for this include sources from biblical scholars, but also sources from secular mainstream Egyptology. So 4 of the books that I would recommend are The Riddle of the Exodus by James D. Long, Pharaoh by Rabbi Alexander Houle, Ancient Near Eastern History and Culture, 3rd edition, which is a textbook, and also the Ipuwer Papyrus, which is an Egyptian document that describes, as we will see, things that are rather similar to what is in the Book of Exodus. So this is going to be probably a long video, and there's a lot of details to work through, but I'm going to try to walk you through all of this step by step, and along the way, I think you'll understand a lot more about ancient Egypt, about Egyptology, and so on. So hope you enjoy it. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably already know what the Exodus is, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically, the book of Exodus in the Bible talks about how the Jews were slaves in Egypt. Okay, so at one point, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, were slaves in Egypt. Then God used 10 miraculous plagues to destroy Egypt. Then the Jews escaped from slavery and crossed through the Red Sea. And finally, they received the Torah at Mount Sinai 40 days later. Okay, so that is essentially what the book of Exodus is describing. And in my experience, and based on, my reading of things, it seems that the lack of historical support for this story is a major stumbling block for people. The fact that Egyptologists have not confirmed that this actually happened, it makes people wonder, like, is the Bible true? Are the 5 books of Moses true? Is this just some old folk tale, right? And I think, it's a reasonable conundrum to be facing, okay? But as I've said, the the information and the scholarship that's come out over the last 5-10 years or so points towards the fact that this did happen and that we can finally understand how and when it happened. Okay, but in order to unpack that, we're first going to have to look at mainstream Egyptology and what the so-called experts say about ancient Egypt. Because they say no Exodus. Okay, experts basically say that based on their interpretation of the Egyptian historical record, archaeological and historical evidence for the biblical Exodus doesn't seem to exist. And biblical scholars, particularly those operating within the Christian tradition, they are not able to definitively prove their case. You know, there are some theories and there's a bunch of videos made by Christian scholars that are on YouTube, but without access to Jewish historical records like Seder Olam and Me'am Loez, they don't have all the puzzle pieces that they need in order to construct a truly convincing argument. Okay? So basically, in mainstream Egyptology, they've constructed a timeline of how they think ancient Egypt went. And that's what I've got on the screen right now. You know, in 4000 BCE and 3000 BCE, there were, you know, this was kind of the pre-dynastic era, is what they call it. And then there was the first pharaoh, and then there was the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And there was some chaos and mini collapses throughout that time, but nothing to the extent of what's described in the book of Exodus. So when Egyptologists, you know, hear about the Exodus, they look at this timeline and they say it couldn't possibly have happened. Okay? Now, for their part, biblical scholars have settled on Ramses II as being the most likely pharaoh of slavery. Okay? And in the movie, The Ten Commandments, they even name him as Ramses and so on. So, like, the consensus in the Christian biblical world seems to be that Ramses II would have been the pharaoh of slavery. But there's a massive problem with this. And that problem is that Ramses II was one of the most successful pharaohs of his time period. There is no evidence that a slave revolt occurred under his reign, and no evidence of a kingdom-wide collapse like was depicted in the book of Exodus. Okay, so saying that Ramses II would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus just doesn't line up with the evidence that we have about what happened during his reign. Okay, which leaves us at a bit of a crossroads, because either, you know, we're completely wrong and the Exodus didn't happen, or there's more to the story and we need to dig through the sands of time and figure out how and when the Exodus happened. Now, interestingly, there are some archaeological clues that support the biblical narrative of the Exodus. Okay, so in Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn Museum, there's a papyrus which has a list of 95 slaves held in Thebes. Some of the listed slaves have Jewish names like Asher, Menachem, Issachar, right? So there does seem to be some evidence that Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. Okay? But, you know, this isn't necessarily definitive. It's just a clue. Okay? Similarly, there's something known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, which is a very enigmatic document that speaks of many catastrophes that befell the Egyptian kingdom. It's been dismissed as an oddity by mainstream Egyptologists because the papyrus itself is a 19th dynasty artifact, but the language and so on that's used in the papyrus seems to be a lot older. So it seems like this papyrus was a copy of another document. And so Egyptologists don't really know what to do with this, especially because when you look at the text of the document, you find that there are some things in it that are strikingly similar to the biblical narrative. Okay, so on the screen I've got just a few examples. all the water in the Nile turned to blood in Exodus, and the Ipuwer Papyrus says, "Behold, the river is blood, and yet men drink of it. Men shrink from tasting, they thirst after water." There's also some references to the secrets of kings of Egypt are divulged, and a serpent being taken from its hole. And in the book of Exodus, there's this instance when the Hebrews are leaving, where they get gifts from the Egyptians, silver, gold, and so on. And this is also highlighted in the Ipuwer Papyrus, where it says that gold and lapis, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the necks of female slaves. So the Ipuwer Papyrus is talking about some kind of wealth transfer. And then the book of Exodus talks about how God descended in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And the Ipuwer Papyrus says that the fire has mounted up on high, its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land. And there's a bunch more things in the Ipuwer Papyrus that seem to map to what happened in the book of Exodus. I myself have a copy of the Ipuwer Papyrus. If you go on Amazon and search for admonitions of an Egyptian sage, you'll be able to buy it for yourself, and you can go through it. So the Ipuwer Papyrus is a very striking document, and people in the biblical world obviously point to this as evidence for the Exodus. But the problem is that without being able to definitively say when and how the Exodus happened, okay, and without the ability to contextualize this document within an understanding of Egyptian history, it remains a clue. It remains just a clue. Now, interestingly, there's an Egyptian scribe named Manetho who mentions that God smote Egypt during the reign of Thutmose. Okay, and again, this is just another clue. Without being able to contextualize this within an understanding of ancient Egyptian history, it remains just a clue, but it is very interesting. There's also something known as the Amarna letters, which are correspondences between Canaanite princes and the pharaohs Amenhotep III and IV. They describe a people called the Hapiru, which historians generally associate with Hebrews, taking over the land of Canaan, including a city called Jerusalem. Okay? And this is described later on in the 5 books of Moses, how the people, how the Jews came and conquered the land and made it Israel. So the Amarna letters seem to offer some corroboration for that aspect of the story. But again, it's just a clue. It's just a clue. So what these clues suggest is that there were Hebrew slaves in Egypt at some point. There was a disaster in Egypt at the time the Ipuwer Papyrus was written. There was a disaster in Egypt during the Thutmose dynasty. And the Hapiru took over Canaan during the reigns of Amenhotep III and the IV. Okay? But as I've mentioned before, the problem is that these are just puzzle pieces that vaguely suggest something happened. Biblical scholars are not currently able to definitively explain how and when the Exodus happened. And, as I've mentioned, in order to do that, we're going to have to re-examine Egyptology and some of the assumptions that it's made. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to revisit the dynastic chronology and the timeline that Egyptologists have constructed for ancient Egypt. Okay, so I'm just bringing up the timeline again here. The current assumption is that there was a pre-dynastic period. The first pharaoh happened around 3000 BCE. Then there was the Old Kingdom. Then there was the Middle Kingdom. There was a bit of chaos. Then the New Kingdom. And then the decline of the kingdom. And this all seems well and good, but we have to ask ourselves, how did Egyptologists come up with this timeline? How was this timeline constructed? Okay, and on what assumptions was it constructed? So some of the evidence that has been unearthed include king lists. So these are inscriptions on walls, like in temples and so on, that have lists of pharaohs that reigned, their name, and also how long they reigned for. Okay, so there are a number of king lists that have been found. There's the Palermo stone, which records first dynasty to the fifth dynasty. There's the Karnak king list, which records the first dynasty to the 18th dynasty. There's the Saqqara king list, which records the first dynasty to the 19th dynasty. And there's the Abydos king list, which records the first dynasty to the 19th dynasty. Now, unfortunately, Egyptologists are trying to put together a very difficult puzzle because the king lists are often contradictory with regards to the order and length of reigns and even the names of the pharaohs. Okay, so basically what Egyptologists have done is they've found these king lists and they said, okay, these pharaohs reigned in this order, and this pharaoh reigned for this long, and this pharaoh reigned for this long. And so they've basically constructed a linear timeline of ancient Egypt based on these king lists. However, there's a bit of a problem with, the Egyptian calendar versus our calendar. Because with the king lists alone, we don't actually know when the pharaohs reigned. We only know for how long. Okay, and so that's where the Sothic system comes into play. So the Egyptian calendar had 365 days and no leap years. And so this means that the calendar shifted in relation to the Gregorian calendar by a quarter of a day each year. Okay, so as you know, we have a leap year every 4 years and so on. And the actual length of the year is 365 days and a quarter, about, right? So because the Egyptian calendar had 365 days and no leap years, the calendar falls back a quarter of a day each year. And so it becomes difficult to relate the Egyptian calendar to our calendar and get some fixed dates for when certain pharaohs reigned. However, Egyptologists have constructed the Sothic system, and basically what they've done is they've used dated sightings of the star Sirius, or Sopdet, found in Egyptian records. Because this star rises at the same time every year, and Egyptians were tracking it, Egyptologists can use this as a fixed reference point. Okay, and I'll show you what this means. So there's a temple papyrus that is dated to the reign of Senusret III. Okay, and it says that on the 8th month and the 16th day of the 8th month, Sirius was rising. Okay, and then there's a temple inscription dated to the time of Thutmose III, which says that Sirius rose on the 28th day of the 11th month. Okay, and so when you take those two dates, month 8, day 16, and month 11, day 28, you find that there's 102 days of fallback. Okay, and so Egyptologists calculate that there were therefore 408 years between Senusret III and Thutmose III. And so between the Sothic system and the king lists, Egyptologists are able to say, okay, Senusret III reigned at this time, and this pharaoh reigned after him, this pharaoh reigned after him. So they're kind of filling in the puzzle with the king lists. Okay? And so what we have is basically a rough timeline that Egyptologists have constructed that begins roughly with Senusret III and moves forward into, the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. Okay? So this all seems well and good. This is the best guess that Egyptologists have been able to make, and everyone has kind of taken it as a given, right? Because the experts are the experts and so on, right? However, there are some assumptions that Egyptologists have made here. First, they've assumed that their methods of dating the Egyptian timeline are reliable, which includes the Sothic system. They've also assumed that Upper and Lower Egypt were a united kingdom with one pharaoh. And third, they've assumed that the succession of pharaohs is linear, as in one at a time. There was only one pharaoh at a time. Okay? So what we have to do in order to revisit the dynastic chronology is we have to revisit these assumptions. So thanks to the archaeological work that's been done, we have 39 astronomical events that can be checked with sophisticated computer programs that search back into the ancient night sky. However, when we look at computer models of the night sky, we haven't been able to match those astronomical events to what was actually happening in the sky at that time. However, someone named David Lappin, I think he's from the University of Glasgow, he managed to locate a period almost 2 centuries later where 97% matching is achieved. Okay, and we find this scholarship in Pharaoh by Rabbi Alexander Houle. Okay, so basically, the Sothic system, as currently constructed, has been demonstrated to be incorrect by computer modeling of the night sky. Okay, and because of, this incorrectness, we now have to compress the mainstream timeline of the Middle Kingdom by 200 years. Okay, because if the astronomical events that were recorded only match a specific period in time, okay, it means that we have to shift everything forward by 200 years. And given the king lists, this makes it impossible for pharaohs to have ruled in linear succession during that time. There's simply too many pharaohs in too little time for this to have been a linear succession. Okay, which means that we now have to rethink the entire dynastic chronology of ancient Egypt. And on the screen, I've got, some hard dates for this. So when we move everything up by 200 years, Senusret III would have reigned in 1692 BCE as opposed to the 1800s. And this just compresses everything and makes the current Egyptian dynastic chronology impossible. Okay, but we're now left with the problem, because the king lists say that there were so many pharaohs and they reigned for such and such a time. Okay, how do we compress this? How do we fix this problem? Okay, and this brings us to the second assumption that Egyptologists have made, which is that Egypt was always a united kingdom with one pharaoh. In ancient Near Eastern history and culture, which is considered a standard textbook on these topics, it even mentions just before the end of the Second Dynasty, there may have been some conflict, possibly even civil war, between different areas of Egypt. Lower Egypt seems to have broken away from the pharaoh's control. Okay, and so this gives us a potential answer. Okay, because if we know that there were so many pharaohs and they reigned for such and such a time, the only way to fix this issue is by Upper and Lower Egypt being separate kingdoms, at least for some period of time. Okay? And there is some evidence that this was the case. When we look at the crowns that different pharaohs and people are depicted as wearing, we find that there are different crowns for Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay, we find that there are different crowns for Upper and Lower Egypt. And there are some other clues. So when you look at Egyptian art and Egyptian depictions of things, we find that Horus and Set, who represent the south and the north, okay, or the north and the south, they are depicted as being in partnership. Okay, there's an Afrocentric scholar named Shaka Amos who has brought this up. This depiction is traditionally interpreted as being a battle between Horus and Set, but Shaka Amos has brought up that this actually depicts a partnership. Set represents the south and Horus represents the north. And so what we're actually seeing in this inscription is a geographical contract between the north and the south. Okay? So it seems, based on the civil war that happened at the end of the Second Dynasty, and based on what we're forced to conclude from re-examining the Sothic system that there might have been two pharaohs ruling at any given time. Okay? And interestingly, when we look at the king lists, this seems like it might be the case. So the Karnak king list in particular interpolates 3 6th dynasty pharaohs between 11th and 12th dynasty pharaohs. Okay, and Egyptologists are currently unable to explain how or why this is the case. Okay, because if the timeline of ancient Egypt is what the experts say it is, there would be no reason for ancient Egyptians to have said 11th dynasty pharaoh ruled, 11th dynasty pharaoh ruled, 6th dynasty pharaoh ruled, 6th dynasty pharaoh, 6th dynasty pharaoh, 12th dynasty. Okay? There would be no reason for the ancient Egyptians to do that. They wouldn't have made that kind of mistake. Okay? That's a pretty big mistake to make. And so the fact that the Karnak king list has this kind of interpolation suggests that there might have been something else going on here. And what I'm proposing to you is that there were different pharaohs for Upper and Lower Egypt. And currently we're misinterpreting that as, a linear succession. Now, interestingly, when you look at the capital cities of the different dynasties, we find that the capital city changes sometimes inexplicably. Okay, so it started out in Thebes or Upper Egypt. Then in the 3rd dynasty to the 8th dynasty, it was in Memphis or Lower Egypt. And then it switched a whole bunch of times. Okay, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Okay, because the capital of the United States has always been Washington, D.C. The capital of France has always been Paris. They're not switching their capital, okay? France is not switching the capital, So it's like, why would ancient Egyptians have switched their capitals so many times? It doesn't quite make sense. So what I'm proposing to you is that the most likely explanation of all of this is as follows. By aligning sightings of the Sirius star to models of the ancient night sky, we're able to place certain pharaohs at specific points in history. Okay, no one is disputing this. However, the only way to resolve the compression issues in the mainstream chronology is by realizing that some pharaohs in Upper and Lower Egypt ruled at the same time, which would alter the dynastic timeline significantly. And this claim is supported by the Karnak king list, as well as the string of earlier dynasties located in Memphis, which seem to have broken away following a civil war at the end of the 2nd dynasty. So, just to recap, Egyptologists currently assume that there was a linear succession of pharaohs, one at a time, and that Egypt was always a united kingdom. However, when we look at the evidence, and particularly the astronomical evidence from the Sothic system, we're forced to conclude that this civil war in the 2nd dynasty meant that the 3rd through 8th dynasties in Memphis were autonomous. Okay, Lower Egypt was its own thing during that time, and Upper Egypt was its own thing during that time, which means that instead of being a linear timeline, what we have is a parallel timeline where you had a pharaoh for Lower Egypt and a pharaoh for Upper Egypt. Okay? Now, I spent months working through this on Excel and looking at all the different reign lengths and everything. And Rabbi Alexander Houle has also done this work. But what we find is, what you see on the screen. So Egypt was united in the 1st and 2nd dynasties, and then the 3rd through 8th dynasty was in Lower Egypt, and at the same time the 11th through 18th dynasty was operating in Upper Egypt. And it also seems that you had some regional powers in Middle Egypt, like the 12th and 13th dynasty. Okay? And at certain times, there was these people called the Hyksos or the Canaanites. They came in and conquered a small section in the north of Egypt in a city known as Avaris. Okay, so a lot of the things that Egyptologists have already identified we can now better contextualize it in terms of Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt being, separate powers, at least until they were reunified in the 18th dynasty. Okay, so now comes the really fun part. We get to put all of these pieces together to figure out how and when the Exodus happened. So we're going to start out with Jewish records of their own history, because the Jews would be the authorities on their own history, right? If we're going to ask anybody about the history of the Jews, it would be the Jews. Okay? And so their records indicate that the Exodus happened in 1313 BCE. Okay, so we now have a year where we think the Exodus happened, 1313 BCE. And then what we're going to have to do is take that date, 1313 BCE, and compare it to our new understanding of the Egyptian historical record to figure out who was the pharaohs during that time. Is there evidence of this? Do we see in Upper and Lower Egypt evidence that such an event occurred? Okay, so when we look at the revised timeline, the parallel timeline, we find that in 1313 BCE, the 18th dynasty was active in Upper Egypt, and the 6th dynasty was active in Lower Egypt. Okay, and specifically, based on this timeline, the pharaoh in Lower Egypt was Merenre-Nemtemsaf II, and the pharaoh in Upper Egypt was Thutmose II. Okay, so now what we have to do is look at the reigns of Merenre-Nemtemsaf II and the reign of Thutmose II to see if the events of the Exodus would be corroborated by things that happened during their reigns. Okay, so first we're going to look at Merenre-Nemtemsaf II, who would be the pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, the Jews, as far as we could tell, were primarily concentrated in Lower Egypt. And so when Moses was going and saying, "Let my people go," and all of those things, the pharaoh that he would have been talking to was Merenre-Nemtemsaf II. So when we look at this pharaoh, we find he reigned for 1 year and 1 month in the second half of the 23rd century, in the second half of the Old Kingdom period. Okay, Wikipedia says 23rd century BC, but as we know from the timeline, that's incorrect. However, Wikipedia also says less than 3 years after his death, the Old Kingdom period ended and the chaos of the first intermediate period started. Okay, so the end of this pharaoh's reign is marked with kingdom-wide chaos. Okay, and we also find that his reign was a period leading up to the collapse of the Old Kingdom and the subsequent first intermediate period. Okay, so it would seem, based on an initial survey of, commonly available sources, that this pharaoh, Merenre-Nemtemsaf II, he basically presided over the collapse of the kingdom. Okay, so far things check out. Now it gets even more interesting. When we look at the second chapter of Exodus, we find that the pharaoh died and there was a new pharaoh that came into power. Okay, and also from Jewish records, we find that the period of the plagues and so on, the plagues happened about 1 per month. Okay, and so it would make sense that this new pharaoh would have only ruled for about a year before the Exodus blew everything apart. Okay, so the fact that Merenre II only reigned for a year and a month, this checks out. This checks out. Okay, so we've got another check mark. So now we have to look at Upper Egypt, or Thutmose II. What was going on for the Thutmoses? And this is where things get really interesting, because a key part of the Exodus was the plague of boils. Okay, so the Egyptians were cursed with boils and so on, and we find this on the mummies of the Thutmose dynasty. Okay, Thutmose II is covered in boils. Queen Hatshepsut also covered in boils, and Thutmose III also has boils. Okay, so this is very, very interesting because this also checks the box of something was happening to the Tutmoses, and it very well could have been the plague of boils. Now, the queen of Upper Egypt was Queen Hatshepsut, and she, in her temple, there's inscriptions that say that Egypt was ruined and gone to pieces before she had to take over from her husband who died. Okay, and this would have coincided with the plague of boils and the catastrophe throughout Upper and Lower Egypt. And there's also a reference to a population of vagabonds that were responsible for overthrowing that which had been made and causing these issues in the kingdom. Okay, so not only do we have Merenre II presiding over collapse in Lower Egypt, we also have this issue where there was chaos and collapse in Upper Egypt, and Queen Hatshepsut basically came in and held down the fort until her son, Thutmose III, ascended to the throne and reunited Egypt. Okay, so this all checks out. This all checks out. Okay, and that's pretty amazing. And this would also explain one of the clues that I mentioned earlier. Manetho, the Egyptian scribe, said that during the reign of Thutmose, God smote Egypt. Okay, this all starts to make perfect sense now. Okay. So just to recap, when we look at the revised Egyptian dynastic chronology, and we look at the year 1313 BCE, we find that Merenre II was ruling in Lower Egypt, Thutmose II was ruling in Upper Egypt. There is evidence of collapse and calamity in the records of both of these dynasties, and the Thutmose royal family, they all have boils, which no one can explain. Okay, very, very interesting. Now, the Thutmose dynasties were part of the 18th dynasty. And so this would also explain why the Ipuwer papyrus was transcribed in the 19th dynasty. Okay, because these events would have still been relatively recent in the time of the 19th dynasty. So it makes sense why such an enigmatic document would have been deemed worthy enough to transcribe and reproduce during that time. Okay? And the fact that the language and so on seems to be much older suggests, at least to me, that the older 6th dynasty was the one that produced the original text, and then later on this was reproduced and transcribed by the 19th dynasty. So the Ipuwer papyrus starts to make a lot more sense given this context. Okay, so anyway, to summarize, when we fix the Egyptian dynastic chronology, it shows us that the 6th dynasty and the 18th dynasty happened at the same time. This means that Merenre II and Thutmose II were the ruling pharaohs at the time of the Exodus. Evidence from both these dynasties shows us that there was collapse and strife in both Upper and Lower Egypt at that time. The Thutmose mummies have boils, Manetho speaks of being smote by God, and the Ipuwer papyrus provides additional corroboration of calamity. And so when we put this all together and we think critically about the Egyptian dynastic chronology and we look at the evidence that's available, it really does seem that the Exodus happened as written. Okay, and primarily it was Lower Egypt that blew it for everybody. Okay, the Pharaoh Merenre II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus depicted in the Bible. He was the hard-headed one who wouldn't let the people go, and he was the one who brought on all these calamities for both Lower and Upper Egypt. However, from the Brooklyn Slave Papyrus, we know that Upper Egypt was also, keeping Hebrew slaves, so it would make sense why they got punished as well. And so, yeah, that is the evidence for the Exodus. That's what I wanted to share in this video. I know that this is probably a very dense video. There's a lot to think through. If you want what I've talked about in a written form, my book, Ticket to Heaven, is available on Amazon, and it's got a full breakdown of this in written form, and also all sources are cited, all references are cited. Specifically, chapter 31 is called Straight Outta Egypt. And that is the chapter in this book that has all of the Egyptian evidence. Now, also in Ticket to Heaven, if you're really into biblical stuff, you would like this book because I also provide a breakdown of the Genesis creation narrative. I also talk about the Kuzari principle, which is essentially Judaism as a human blockchain. And I talk about a number of other topics related to biblical truth that you might be interested in. And if you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, give a like to this video and a subscribe. I'm going to be posting more things related to biblical truth and biblical proofs. I'm going to be talking about Kabbalah in a number of capacities. And I'm also going to be just, sharing biblical and Torah content. So, yeah, thank you very much for sitting through this video. I know it might have been a bit of a slog, but I think it's really exciting because we're now able to construct a strong and solid argument for the Exodus. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes along with this in terms of Joseph and his role in Egypt, right? And all of those things. We're now able to put names to Pharaoh or the various pharaohs that are named. So it's very, very interesting stuff. This is, I think it's an exciting development in Egyptology. And the cool thing is Egyptologists themselves are starting to question their own timeline. Okay, but they just haven't, come to these specific conclusions yet. But they're getting there. So this video means that you are now at the leading edge of Egyptology and also at the leading edge of biblical scholarship. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. Like and subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon.